and asked me if I would be willing to chair a commission to look into all of that and to look into how we in the community can be more racially inclusive, which was a very scary moment. I was very nervous about taking it because it's a big task, and because I'm not myself observant, and so yeah, I'm very much the kind of phrase I keep using is yeah, kind of, if you have glory supporters who only turn up when you're in the FA Cup final, I guess I'm a greedy supporter, and I very much turn up when my great aunt is offering me a seat at her Passover Seder, and I'll turn up for Simchat Torah. But as indeed will most of my family, we're you know, very much yeah, kind of high holy days observers. Although I'm told that my great aunt has now cracked the art of doing her own challah bread in lockdown. I have yet to do so, partly because our bakery reopened so quickly. But the reason why I decided to say yes was because of the respect I had really gained for the board over the last 5 years of my job, when regrettably, because of the various issues we've had covering the Labour Party and within the Labour Party, I've got to know their political team very well. And I thought, well, I feel they navigated a very difficult situation there with considerable grace and finesse. So I'm going to trust in their good judgment and put aside my own doubts about my ability to do this. So what we've done thus far is we've had our first meeting to discuss the terms of reference. Essentially, because although when it was announced, I got a number of very supportive and helpful emails, texts, WhatsApp messages, Facebook messages, Twitter messages with what people thought the problem was, I wanted to be able to gather as many people in the, as many Black British Jews and as many Jews of various other groups and diasporas to discuss with them what they felt the problems and the terms of reference should be. We're now in the process of setting those terms of reference, which will shape the evidence gathering sessions that I will conduct throughout most of the next 3 months. There'll then be a kind of second wave of evidence gathering sessions in which I talk to, I really need to find a better word than stakeholders, which is one of those horrible phrases I just can't stand, but in which we will talk to stakeholders, so leaders of synagogues, the CST, schools, whatever it is that comes out in the first stage of the report. And over that 3-month period, the aim is to produce 4, 5, maybe 6 very concrete and deliverable recommendations that can be, yeah, then we can come back and look at over a period of years to see whether or not they are being achieved. So it is both ambitious in scope, in then what we want to do at the end is produce something that can happen and will bring about change. It is, yeah, it is of course going to be of slightly less ambitious in scope than yeah, and then it will be talking about things that we can solve ourselves in the community. Here in England, some JFS alumni have written a very thoughtful letter talking about curriculum changes, and one of the things they have acknowledged in their letter to the school is, of course, some of these are issues that involve having to lobby the government for more flexibility over what can be taught in the curriculum in England and Wales. Although I think causes like that are very important, very inspiring, and I want to mention them and pay tribute to them in the report, I think it's unlikely that anything which involves saying first lobby the government will end up being a recommendation in the report, because I very much am looking for things that we can do ourselves alone, rather than necessarily things that, as worthwhile as they are, and I think it is a very well-written and thoughtful letter, and I hope they're successful, but I'm very keen that it not be things that produce a kind of laundry list of recommendations, not least because, of course, I'm aware that across our various communities, some things have devolved, some things aren't, and I want them to be things that are, yeah, that are tangible and achievable in every part of the United Kingdom. So that's kind of the process and my kind of thinking on it at the present time. That's what we're sort of going to be doing. I'm so grateful for all of the kind of help and very positive messages we've had thus far. But yeah, any questions at all really about the commission or in general would, yeah, please do fire away.
I'm just going to unmute myself briefly to thank you, Stephen, for that introduction, which is very positive. I particularly like your reference that it shouldn't be a laundry list of things that the government has to do. I know myself, having been in the civil service for 30 years, that the government don't like these lists, and self-help is a wonderful thing as well. And with those remarks, I hand it over to Fiona to let us know what's come up in the chat room.
Yes, so no questions so far. So if anybody's got any questions, maybe I can just flick through the pictures, put your hands up and I'll unmute you and go for it. Anybody want to say something?
Mark Taylor has put a question. How are you going to engage with small communities?
So in some ways, I think that's actually one of the few things that this weird way we're all having to live at the moment has made slightly easier. One of the difficulties we've had thus far is then, of course, all of those, as you'll all know, right, all of those soft social cues, when someone's tired or when someone's feeling a bit upset, are so much harder over Zoom. But fortunately, distance and smallness is not one of them. The calls for evidence are going out and are designed to draw the net as broadly as possible. And when we look over the first evidence gathering session, I anticipate, well, I hope, of course, there will be no gaps. I anticipate then it will become clear as and when there are gaps, which things I have to specifically kind of go out and seek more evidence on, which will be one of the things that in that second stage we do. Is then we'll kind of, particularly because, of course, because self-help, as you brilliantly put it, is one of my focuses. One of the things I'm very keen to hear is about what things then people feel we are doing well in one part of the community or in one denomination or another, because I think that will be really where we can find these concrete recommendations that we can do ourselves alone, rather than having to kind of produce a list of, first ask for this or lobby for that.
We've got other questions. What obstacles or challenges do you anticipate?
So I think, some of the big obstacles, just in terms of the kind of, so actually I did a talk a bit like this to HSBC's Jewish network, because Stephen Pollard couldn't make it, and so as I feel I often disappoint people by being someone else more famous, I disappointed them, but they were very kind. And I got a very thoughtful email after that from someone who said, well, yeah, they said, look, I don't identify as Jewish in a religious sense, and they said, and I didn't feel I identified as Jewish in a sense beyond a culinary sense almost. They said up until the last couple of years and the death of my father, and I started to occasionally go to synagogue, and they kind of said, and I'm concerned that if I hadn't looked like the other people who were more observant, I wouldn't have felt welcome when I turned up. And I think one of the obstacles is that this gentleman was exactly right about one of the issues, but of course it's very hard to reach out to someone who's in that group. I think about my own grandfather, who went from being someone who was not observant to, in the end of his life, someone for whom the religious aspect of Judaism became very central to his identity. And it's very hard to get an accurate sense of what those problems are, because hopefully, well, not hopefully, we only are in the last stages of our life once. Very few of us will actually. And one of the joys, perversely, of my grandfather's last years is because he did have a fairly firm diagnosis for some time. He was able to do that kind of setting of his personal and theological affairs in some kind of order. And I'm very aware that the issues that this person's raised in this email are things which are going to be difficult to accurately track, because those of us who aren't observant only kind of get religious at the end of our lives once. And our experience is often we can't give evidence about it. And I think that type of thing, and the kind of experiences of people who are linked into the kind of commercial or cultural, but not the spiritual life of the community, will be slightly harder to talk to address. We are working on it, but I think that is going to be one of the challenges. The other challenge, of course, as with any issues of this, is coming up with a term to describe people that everyone is, if not happy with, at least comfortable with. I know many people, including some people in the same families, who really dislike the term of colour. And I'll be honest, I'm sort of one of those people, but I know lots of other people who find it a very useful term. And in the end, I think what we've had to kind of, what I've basically had to say to people is that you've got to accept that some of these terms are going to be a bit amorphous. And you just have to, what we're trying to be is as open to as many people as possible, because it is a commission on racial inclusivity. It's inspired and driven by this particular moment and this particular injustice, but we are trying to focus on the issues of inclusivity that affect Yemeni Jews, Mizrahi Jews, and not just Black British Jews. So those are, I think, some of the specific challenges.
That's fantastic. So I'm echoing a bit. So we've got a couple of people who are going to speak to us about their personal experiences. We'll have Fiona Kamari Campbell first, and then Des Shanko. So Fiona, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah. Hello, everybody. And look, I'm just really overjoyed that this topic's being discussed. So I'm a Sri Lankan Jew. Very white-looking Sri Lankan Jew, and I just wanted to raise a couple of issues. I'm involved in the BAME network at my university, and we are discussing, I guess, some of the common threads between BAME issues and anti-Semitism at the university. It's been a difficult conversation, I think, because our university didn't sign up to the international definition, but at least there's an openness there, and we don't get hostility. I think just from a personal perspective, I think the hardest thing, and I know I've spoken to my daughter about this, and she's just about to turn 19, just for age relevance here. I think the hardest thing for us, and you can probably tell by my accent, I'm not from the UK, is I think going to synagogues and finding actually cultural difference, I think, among Jews. It's different in the US, for example, where it's not unusual to find Jews of Asian descent. And I think that's it's actually a really important psychological issue, because I think that you don't see that kind of familiar resemblance. So I think and that's hard. I mean, obviously it's hard in the Scottish context because there are low percentages of people from non-white Scottish backgrounds anyway. But I think maybe schools can potentially maybe try and have welcoming strategies around that, and to kind of link up Jews together in some even informal network who are from a non-white Scots background. So I think that's really important. And just to continue the conversation, I think we need to dialogue and learn from each other about the issues around Black Lives Matters and the Jewish experience, because actually there's some really strong and powerful threads where we can learn from our various histories. So that's really just all I wanted to particularly say at this stage. I think the very fact that we're having this conversation is really vital, and we need to have more of them. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And I think you're completely right about the value of us even having these conversations. And I hope you'll be able to come along to some of the Zoom evidence sessions, because I think one of the really positive things is merely by existing, people are starting to form informal networks, which is very good. And also the thing we should be very clear and proud of as a community is no other diaspora community has done a commission like this, and no other, as far as we're aware, religious community in the UK has done something like this. So I think it's hugely positive that we're starting on this journey, and I hope that that's another reason for me why I want it to be self-help, and I want this to be something that is a useful model to the Anglican Communion if it wants to do something like this, the Muslim Council of Britain if it wants to do something like this. And I think, as you say, that sense that you look around and you are not the same as other people is one of the things that is definitely going to be a golden thread of many of the evidence and the problems that we encounter in this evidence finding phase. So
thanks. So we've got somebody else who's going to talk about their personal experiences, and then we've got questions from Mia Spiro, David Blyman, and John Danzig. So Des Shanko first. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Hello. I think you probably, I sent a note saying that my background's coming from Ethiopian Jew. I left Ethiopia at the age of 18. And when I was growing up, I've known nothing else than a Jewish boy. And it wasn't easy to locally to say, I am Jewish, but we're always scared of the locals. But apart from that, my Jewish village in Ethiopia, with my mother and my father being a Jew, it's always been Jewish. But I have never ever been experienced to call myself, I am Black Jewish. I know I am Black, but I am Jewish. Until I was told in one occasion, my children said to me, Dad, we can't have a Shabbat service always at home. There is a synagogue, which is my youngest son, who's 21 now, and nearly getting graduate now. And he says to me, Dad, I've been to synagogue, we should go to synagogue. So I sat my 4 kids, and I said, I'm going to see the rabbi today, and I will tell him, I'm Ethiopian Jew, if you could welcome us to the Shabbat service. But the meeting lasted 10 to 15 minutes. The rabbi would not even acknowledge I am Jew. But I did ask him to arrange to come to Shabbat service, but he said no. But he did mention a conversion. I said, how can I be converted to Jews? I am already Jew. But I never got a response to that. And when I got back, my kids, my wife who is Jewish, all waiting what the response was from the rabbi. And I told them that was the case. I think my kids were more upset than me. So I just want to say to Stephen, you did mention about the Yemeni Jew and all that. You never mentioned Ethiopian Jew. I wouldn't say I'm the only one, but there are other Israeli Jews who are living in the United Kingdom, but personally, I don't know. It could be 2, it could be 3, it could be only my family. But the happy ending is now, I joined a liberal Jewish community, which I've been very welcome. And it was not easy, but sometimes what we're getting is actually a verbal unwelcomeness or facial unwelcomeness. But this has been going on, I think. When I saw the email, I was grateful to fire away my experience already. I don't know whether you received my experience or not, Stephen.
Yes, thank you. And I have seen you. I'm sorry, it was a terrible oversight on my part, not to specifically mention the concerns and issues of Ethiopian Jews residing here in the United Kingdom, because you are not the only one, and unfortunately, your story or versions like it are ones I've heard several variants on, and and one of the challenges is that it's clear that far too many, they've had to, when they've moved to somewhere else, they've had to change denomination because one of their denomination, I've spoken to people who now have to go to an Orthodox synagogue because they weren't welcome in the Reform synagogue that they'd moved to, even though that was closer to their own theological tradition. And you have other people who've had to make the reverse journey. And although all of those theological traditions are legitimate and respectable, people shouldn't have to make the decision of which synagogue they go to based on anything other than their own theological position. And it's very clear to me that for far too many people like you, that is not the only consideration that is driving where people end up going to worship. So but I'm sorry not to specifically mention that. And thank you very much for your email. And we will be in touch about further evidence giving sessions, because I do think stories like yours are very, very high. I think possibly right at the top of one of the things I feel I have to have a concrete recommendation and proposal for how we can help at the end of this.
Thank you, Stephen.
So the next question is David Blyman. Would you like to unmute?
It was really just a question about how Jews can respond most constructively to the Black Lives Matter agenda, which is something that has been troubling me somewhat.
I don't think there's actually a specific way we as a community should respond to it than is different to any other community in the United Kingdom. There's the added difficulty for us, and this is one of the things that was very clear in the first session, and one of the things which is specifically painful for Black British Jews is that the voice of BLM in the UK, this entirely self-appointed voice, says things that are anti-Semitic, and so that is doubly painful for them. But in some ways, because it is a self-appointed leadership, given I would say undue prominence by two things: Twitter's decision to verify an account that has no, it doesn't have political legitimacy to declare itself the UK chapter of this global movement. And then the broadcasters, particularly the BBC, deciding that this self-appointed leadership deserves a media slot. But the onus on us, the onus as myself, as someone who has two political correspondents and is in the process of hiring a replacement for one because he's defected to the Murdoch empire, is to go, well, how can I be hiring better? How can I be opening up opportunities? Now, in journalism, I still believe that most of the hiring challenges are around widening the pool of people so that you have more people who went to ordinary state schools, and actually more people who went to ordinary state schools outside London. It does sometimes feel that there's this kind of depressing thing in the media that the only regional diversity is diversity of private schools, and the only way to get in via a normal school is if you happen to be in the nation's capital. But the challenge for me in my own sort of working life after in this moment is, how can I make change in my own community, in my own area? And I think that is the way we can usefully engage in this moment.
Thank you. So, Mia, a question about working in universities.
Thank you so much for your talk and for sharing all these insights with me. My question stems from my own experience as a Jewish studies lecturer at the University of Glasgow. And I'm also on the board of the British Association for Jewish Studies. And when the issue in our department, which is a theology and religious studies department, came up of how we can respond to Black Lives Matter issues in our curriculum or what we teach, I found that I and the other Jewish studies person on our staff were very silent, and that the British Association of Jewish Studies were very silent, although the university campuses in these times of political crisis become very important places to actually be very vocal. And I wonder how we can do a little bit more on university campuses to participate in the conversation. I know in my own class I've made efforts to make Jewish studies more inclusive, just in even the images I show, which would not only be Ashkenazi Jews and white Ashkenazi Jews, doing traditions and representing it only from that perspective. But I think there are other ways that perhaps we can do more on university campuses to also somehow speak to, maybe not address, but speak to some of the issues that you've brought up just here with us.
Well, this can be a bit of a cop-out answer, because I'm not saying that everything you're doing is perfect and then there's nothing that could be improved. But in terms of what I've already heard in evidence, actually the simple act of, as you say, images of Jews, particularly British Jews, that aren't just a very stereotypical and narrow image, is a huge thing that a lot of people who are coming forward are asking for. And that is, you know, across the whole spectrum of people within the ambit of this commission. Yeah, I mean, so I was speaking to someone who is, originally from Yemen, and they were saying, they said, I have never seen myself in a picture. Yeah, they said, and for lots of people, I don't know if anyone remembers, there was a very good photo exhibition last year, which did slightly defy those expectations, and several people have emailed to say that they found that very moving. So I think so far it sounds to me like you are absolutely doing the right thing, and that is the right approach. I hope then I will, in the course of the next 6 months, be able to come up with some other useful suggestions for you. But you should feel proud and pleased that you've identified that, because that is an issue of great emotional importance to lots of the people I've spoken to. So well done for doing something about it.
Thank you. There's a question from John Danzig, so I'm just going to cut in now and say one from me, which is that I think it's something about education. I have to shamefully say that I was once on the door at Lancaster University Chaplaincy Centre for Rosh Hashanah service, and an Indian person arrived, and I just looked very straight. I couldn't understand why he was there, and I just assumed he'd come to the wrong place. I really did. And then he said, my father blew the shofar in Delhi synagogue, and I was absolutely shamefaced and and ignorant, basically. And I think there's something about education and telling all of us Jews about other Jewish communities, and that we don't all look like white Ashkenazi Europeans.
Yeah, I think though, equally, you should feel pleased that you identified what, none of us can escape from, the culture we swim in. I mean, the wider English culture, the wider Scottish culture, and the wider British culture. I was sent a very thoughtful essay by a young black man called Elijah Michael that he'd written in his synagogue's newsletter, in which he said, he said, look, the inescapable presence here is that of British anti-Semitism, because British anti-Semitism has drawn an image of us, and those of us who do not fit that image often are then presented by images of ourselves that we do not recognize. And when we move somewhere, people assume that we aren't part of the community. But none of us can escape the fact that we live in a society in which that image of us is presented to us by the wider country. And I think that actually just being aware of it, as you've shown you are, is a hugely positive step. And I think you're exactly right. Education and awareness is going to be a central thing. But I think I'm very keen that people don't feel that by admitting they've done that, then they've done something wrong. I mean, one of the things I've had to confront is that, when I've been sharing events over the last 5 years, with the Jewish Labour Movement or other organisations about the problems in the Labour Party, when I've scanned the crowd, I've started to find myself scanning the crowd for people who look Jewish, which is a ridiculous thing for me to look Jewish to do, and thinking, oh well, they're less likely to be people who will ask, who will be here to cause trouble, will ask difficult questions. Whereas if you've been following some of this stuff within the Labour Party, the people who are the most likely to stand up and say something that causes great pain to other people in the audience are not. You couldn't pick them out of a lineup. And I have to confront that in myself, and I have to know that that's something I do too. And we're none of us perfect, and what we should be aiming to is to do what you have done, which is know that you're not perfect. So yeah, I think that's, yeah, it's very positive, and you're exactly right.
Thanks. So the next questions are John Danzig and then Nicola Livingston.
Hi, Stephen. I'm afraid this is overlapping with some of the points previously made, including Fiona's, but my point is to do with minimizing the perception of the other between minority groups. The importance of communicating and liaising between different minority groups to avoid the fear of minorities within Jewish communities. So that is my point. So much of that fear within Jewish communities, I think, stem probably from perceptions of the views of Jews, and of course the other way around as well, by other minority groups, or at least some of them, obviously.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think, yeah, with the disclaimer, this is very early days, so then I may, of course, at the end of even the next evidence session, suddenly realize, oh, do you remember those days when I thought the central problem was this, how foolish I was? But I think then, one, as you say, greater interaction between minority groups eases some of those fears. But also, it's not just the fact that the board is the first religious community in the UK to do something like this. There are, I think, many useful things that we as a community know, can communicate, can help with, that then allow us to be a very good neighbour. In terms of the painfulness of the fact that here in the UK, Black Lives Matter is represented by a deeply unrepresentative community organisation. Now, I'm not going to pretend that I always agree with everything that the JLC or the board says, but we are in England broadly blessed with strong representative community organisations. And I think that the models that have allowed us to have that are ones that, one of the things that, when I've been covering the issue of Islamophobia in the United Kingdom in the Conservative Party, I talk to British Muslims who are themselves conservatives, and they kind of say, oh, we need to work out how to be as effective as the Jewish labour movement's been. And I did just say, I was like, well, if you pick up the phone, they're not going to cast you out because you're Tories. And I think, that working together of groups is so important, not least, essentially, it's a cliche, but it's true. If you're not safe, I'm not safe. And so, I think you're exactly right.
So, Nicola Livingston and then Bill Chapman.
Hello, and Stephen, thanks very much for speaking with us today. This is really fascinating. I'm involved with Jewish student chaplaincy here in Scotland, and therefore take a lot to do with the different Jewish student societies right across the universities and colleges of Scotland. And obviously, students are an area that you would probably want to gather evidence from, being universities being places where these issues are very much at the forefront. But obviously, coming into the new academic year, there may not be so many students physically here on campus, or even here in the UK, the overseas students who might come. Have you any thoughts about how you're going to reach that group of people?
Yeah, the issues around students are twofold. The first isn't one of the things we're doing at the moment is we're getting some work done for us on safeguarding about how we can do that kind of thing in an appropriate manner. The second, of course, as you rightly say, are the logistical challenges of how would we usually reach those students through higher education institutions, and that may not be an effective issue, an effective method. It's one of those things where, although we have a 6-month target, there is some flex in case it turns out that the reopening, particularly in England, does turn out to be happening too fast. There is flex, precisely so that if it turns out then we realise that we are just incapable of talking to various people or talking to stakeholders in particular because of the circumstances of that we're currently in, there is built-in delay, although I'm very keen for us to be able to get it done by that January date. But we will be working with institutions precisely to give us that kind of reach. But thank you, because university students is otherwise definitely would be something of a blind spot of mine. So thank you very much.
And obviously with the different nations doing things at different speeds as well. So you talked about English lifting of lockdown, but remember in Scotland we're running a good few weeks behind here.
Yeah. So the next is Bill Shackman.
It's actually me, sitting next to Bill Shackman. Yeah, so Stephen, thank you so much for your time today. And I was hoping that you could clarify a little more what the purpose of the commission is, whether it's about disseminating information or making recommendations or effecting changes, and more broadly, what happens after the commission ends.
So the purpose of the commission is first to scope out the kind of, not necessarily actually the scale, that's probably a poor way of putting it, but to scope out what it is the problems are. We've had a very useful gauge of that from people who have come forward to us proactively, but it's also important to work out what the problems are from people who do not feel engaged enough to come forward proactively. Then we will produce these concrete recommendations for action. And what will then happen with those is we will first seek responses from community organisations to those. But then I keep saying to people when I say 6 months, and their eyes light up, and unfortunately that won't be the last they see of me, because we will be coming back on timeframes that we will, once the problems, we've kind of identified what we feel the solutions are. I think it will then be clear what an appropriate amount of time for me to kind of come back and go, well, how much have you progressed with this bucket? That will of course also be one of the things where we're slightly dependent on the situation that we are in. As I said earlier, I think one of the things that lots of people have said to me spontaneously is how much they like that photography exhibition. But we know that at the moment, particularly in England, we have a very bad situation for arts funding. Our government doesn't seem that engaged or interested in doing so. So something which might have seemed like one of the easiest levers to pull, which is to go, it would be good if more exhibitions and cultural stuff reflected this. You might be saying, well, at a time when every cultural institution is facing a fight for survival, is saying this would happen within 6 months a realistic target anymore? But they will be kind of concrete things with time-linked targets that I will then be able to come back and revisit a second time to go, how did this get on? How did this work? What things did I get completely wrong? What recommendations did I make that were so broad as to be useless? But yeah, so it will be a continuous process.
Thank you. So we're coming to the end of contributions. So if anybody has got any questions, put them to me in the chat, or put them to everybody in the chat, or put your hand up, and I might see you. There's a couple of screens, so I can't necessarily see you. Okay, Micheline's got something. Next person is, I've got Derek Livingston first, who's reminding us that it's not that sometimes we're unwelcoming to everybody, not just the Black Jews.
Yeah, can I just come in on, it's about the photography exhibition. I think some people haven't really understood what the photography exhibition is that you're referring to, Stephen, if you wouldn't mind explaining a wee bit further.
Oh, so perhaps last year, perhaps the year before, there was an exhibition in London of photographs and images of British Jews. But it included a number of people who were outside the stereotypical image than people had. And several people have emailed me to say how much they loved and enjoyed that exhibition, because it was the first time they had seen people who looked like themselves, not in their own families, but in photographs. So yeah, it was an artistic exhibition here in England. And I just, as an example of something that is fairly easy, just to go, art and cultural events which showcase our community and all of its use. I think Derek is exactly right, though. Then in many ways, it's a bit like the COVID-19's death rate, which, as we tragically know, you are more likely to die of the novel coronavirus if you are Black British, if you are Jewish, if you are Pakistani. Now, there are a variety of reasons for those higher rates of morbidity. But what are the things which will fix that? More protective equipment, a fully functioning test and trace infrastructure, and to eliminate the rate of cases across the whole of the United Kingdom. Well, what are the things which will help everyone? More protective equipment, a proper test and trace infrastructure, eliminating the rate of cases. And I think in many ways, exactly as you say, making community and cultural and commercial spaces more welcoming is a benefit for everyone. I don't envisage that very many of the recommendations will in practice be things that only benefit one group of people. They will be driven and anchored in the concerns of all of the various groups that come through, and I'm going to make sure that the groups of the smallest and the largest minority within the minority are heard and balanced. But I don't envisage that they won't be things than we aren't all better off as a result of.
Thanks. So Derek Livingston, do you want to add anything? Couldn't see a microphone on your thing, so I'm not sure that you'll be able to speak. And then the next person is Danielle, and we'll come back to you, Derek. Danielle?
Hi, just to join in the thanks for doing this, because I think this is such an important topic for us to engage in. My question was around the extent to which this research is going to focus on synagogue spaces. Obviously, I understand the limits of remit and that being such a focus for our community, but I also suspect that a lot of people who are minorities, and especially younger minorities, may not be engaged in synagogue or faith spaces at all. And a lot of people who feel included, even based on solely the perception of the community, may never have stepped foot in a synagogue in the UK, and therefore don't have that experience to speak of. So I'm just wondering to what extent we're focusing on synagogues, and to what extent we're focusing out with synagogues as well.
So it will be both. I'm very much trying to be led by the evidence I've had thus far in what I specifically talk about. But one of the things that has come up is not just religious spaces, but also communal spaces. So to take an example of something someone specifically said, something JW3 here in Northwest London. I say here in Northwest London, I'm actually in Northeast London. I'm just desperately trying to increase the value of my flat by claiming it's in Northwest London. But here in London, some people have, I've actually always found JW3 a very nice and welcoming space, but some people clearly haven't. So it will be across community spaces, but also commercial community spaces. One of the things, again, that I've heard, there was a very good set of pieces in the Jewish News, I think last week, and some people talked about accessing, kind of commercial spaces, just when they're going to get salt, or they're going to get kosher stock, right? So all of that will be across, will be part of the inquiry's focus.
Thanks. Derek, do you want to add anything? Unmute yourself. Unmute yourself.
Done. Yeah, I think that at least some of what goes on is nothing to do with there being a bias against Black people, but there's a bias against strangers in quite a lot of shows, particularly if one ever goes to Northwest London. I mean, I was saying in the comment I put online, when I go abroad, and even in some parts of London, you get that I didn't know there was Jews in Scotland stuff. And in much the same way, you get people who didn't know there was Black Jews, people who didn't know there was Sri Lankan Jews, people who didn't know there was Jews from other places. And there are people who are just so cliquey and caught up in their own little circles. They're not interested in any strangers who come in to show. I like to actually think that position is rather different in Scotland, and that on the whole, people are welcomed here. But that said, there's always an element of security which now comes into it as well, and any stranger in show, particularly one who's not contacted the show ahead and who's not known, is going to be looked on with suspicion, whatever colour they might be.
Yeah, there are two specific issues there. I instinctively agree, well, I very firmly agree with the second, which is the one inevitable dimension is the we do have legitimate fears about strangers in our communal spaces. One of the interesting things and this is why I'm very keen that people talk about what's worked well as what's worked badly, is thus far, a lot of the specific complaints I've had about security has been about commercial security at a friend's bar mitzvah, or volunteer security at synagogue services. And the positive stories have been about CST trained volunteers who are given more intensive training and who the CST put a great deal of very worthwhile time and effort into helping them identify precisely what the threat is at any specific moment in any specific time. And so that type of specific evidence is very useful for me, because it may be, with the huge disclaimer, this is very early on in the process, and one of the things that we talk about is, look, a simple way that people's synagogue experience becomes nicer is if your volunteers are CST trained. And actually that should be more, kind of considered less of a gold standard and more of a, you should absolutely do this to be a welcoming space. But I think you're exactly right too, that of the evidence I've had thus far, the commonalities are much, much greater than the differences between the racial origin or visible identity of the people who have come forward. So many of the stories have exactly that structure of, I was fine in the place I grew up, and then I moved and people said, oh, I didn't know there were Scottish Jews, or I didn't know there were Black British Jews, or I didn't know that there were, the list goes on and on. And again, this then same repeated, very sad story of people having to decide to go to, whether they've decided they had to go to an Orthodox synagogue, or they decided they had to go to a liberal synagogue, they decided they had to go to a Reformed synagogue, having to choose their synagogue, not based on their spiritual beliefs, but on which one has been the most welcoming to strangers. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right that a lot of the, and I think one of the interesting things is that just as I think as a community, we have to have a more sophisticated understanding of prejudice than the majority does, for obvious reasons. I think one of the interesting things is that I think that in terms of some of the people who've come forward, people who've identified unwelcoming behavior who look white privileged have tended to be people who have realized later in life that they haven't been welcomed when they've moved. Whereas it tends to be people right at the start of their lives who have immediately gone, oh, I understand what's happened here, when they've moved home for the first time in their 20s. But I think you're right that many of the issues are going to be about educating people about what British Jewry looks like in its fullness, rather than kind of specific stuff about racial prejudice.
Okay, I think we're at the end of our questions. Anybody else got a question or an experience you'd like to tell us about? Wondered if you might, Stephen, if you might like to introduce Anthony, just the person that's collecting the evidence.
Oh yes, so I'm joined on the call by Anthony, who is helping. He's from the board and is acting as my secretariat. We will circulate his and my commission email afterwards, which will be circulated. But Anthony is helpfully providing me with huge amounts of support and guidance, is so on hand. If you do have things you want to talk about, experiences you want to talk about and submit to the review, good and bad, please do email me. We will circulate my commission email because the report is only as good as the evidence we receive. So thank you. Please do that.
And Anthony, would you just unmute yourself and say hello so we can see who we're sending things to?
Hi everyone. Nice to see a few people I know from my time in Glasgow. But yeah, we really want you to come forward if this commission applies to you, if you are a Jew of colour or a Black Jew, or if you know people in your synagogues or wider communities, please tell them to come forward and reach out to us.
So just as chair, I'll come back in at this point. to thank Stephen very much for making time to come and talk to us this afternoon and for responding so thoughtfully to all the different questions and interventions that we've had, and to thank everyone who's participated in the meeting for their very careful points and very constructive points that everybody's made, and to encourage you to keep in touch with Stephen through Anthony to express any further opinions, responses, and if you know anybody who's in this situation, to tell them what we've been talking about and to encourage them to come forward with their feelings and thoughts. I certainly know there have been a few people I've known in Scotland who are not at this meeting but who are affected by the issues, and also a few people in Manchester, and I hope their voices will be heard.